And finally, I want to make sure that everyone knows that we will be having multiple speakers today. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our speakers this morning.
Thanks everyone for joining. Rachel and I will go ahead and introduce ourselves, and then we're looking forward to having a conversation style seminar, and looking forward to your questions. But we've got a few discussion points to get through, and then we'll do a question and answer. So maybe I'll kick it off. My name is Kartik Kumar. I'm the Associate Director for our Climate and Poverty initiative, which I'll speak a little bit more about later at KingPhillipanthropies. We're a Bay Area, Menlo Park-based philanthropic organization funding high-performing organizations operating in emerging markets, specifically focusing on mitigating extreme poverty. But let me hand it over to my counterpart, Rachel.
Thanks, Kartik. I'm Rachel McMonagle. I am the Climate Change and Land Tenure Specialist at Landesa. So I'm our climate change lead for building out our program, and that's working really across our cross-cutting programs and geographic programs, which I can get more into later. Landesa is a land rights organization, so we focus on reducing poverty through land rights. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot more details as the conversation unfolds. A bit more about me is that my background is mostly on the environmental side of things. I work alongside a lot of lawyers within our policy reform field, but my expertise is in climate change mitigation, adaptation, and soil science.
Great. Well, Rachel, thanks. And apologies, this is a little bit of a modified session. We're expecting to have a moderator. We're going to roll with it, and Rachel and I are going to moderate it and be panelists at the same time. So, Rachel, I think what I'll do is let me pose a question to you, and then you'll pose the same question back to me. But when we talk about climate policy, we often think about reduced emissions, and sometimes this can distract from the important social dimensions, such as the role of gender and rights of Indigenous peoples in climate action. I'm curious, Rachel, in terms of Landesa, how does your work address these important dimensions? And I'm happy to answer from the King Philanthropies perspective.
Sure, it's a huge question, and in our planning session, I know we both had a lot to say. I guess to sort of zoom out and talk a little bit more about how Landesa is including climate change within our mission. As I mentioned, we're a land rights organization, so we're headquartered in the US with currently 5 offices in 5 different countries. At the time, we're looking to add a few others. We have offices in Tanzania, Liberia, Myanmar, China, and India, and several cross-cutting programs, including gender, a focus on women's land rights, as well as a research arm and a team working on corporate engagement. And so with this mission on poverty reduction, the focus has always been on the people aspect of land rights and environmental work. And so what we were finding is Landesa has been around for about 50 years, and the value of land rights and the meaning of having secure control of communities' land has really been degraded through climate change. And so with climate change causing land degradation, people's abilities to support their traditional livelihoods on that same land has been greatly reduced. And so when we were looking at using land rights as a tool for poverty reduction, we couldn't be doing that without also addressing climate change as part of that constellation of development issues. And so we found that by focusing on climate change and trying to build climate resilience within the communities that we're securing land tenure for, there were positive outcomes both for the environment, but also for livelihoods. And so through that, it was really building out this program to find interventions that can benefit both livelihoods and the local environment. And it's really based on the idea that when people have secure rights to their land, they see more of this long-term vision, this long-term future, and they will plan accordingly. So they're land management will be much more sustainable, and there will just be a greater focus on kind of that long-term investment in the land rather than seeing this short-term, taking advantage of the resources and fearing that they may not be yours in the future. And so it's a great question that you bring up around the social dimensions, given that our focus is so much on people and including environmental interventions that will have positive outcomes for people at the same time. And so Landesa works with three core populations within our climate program. One is women, Indigenous people, and youth. And so we see women as in this really difficult position of, one, being increasingly vulnerable to climate change. Their roles in communities are typically associated with natural resource management. They're the food producers, they're the caregivers in the home. And so when climate change degrades local lands, their livelihoods and their roles within the community are much more challenged. They're also at greater risk for gender-based violence if they need to travel further to access natural resources that used to be more readily available, or perhaps there are situations where their male counterparts have gone into cities or other towns for alternative livelihoods, and women are left to manage the home without the decision-making power that secure land tenure provides. And so the act of securing land tenure for women and adding their names to the titles gives them a lot of security, a lot of political power, and a lot of decision-making ability within the household and the community to enact more of this sustainable land management planning, more of this long-term sustainable land governance that can translate into climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so that's kind of our angle into at least the women's side of things. On the Indigenous peoples front, I think it's at this point a well-known fact that they're incredible land stewards who have been managing the land for many generations. And with climate change, we're seeing a lot more land grabs, a lot more encroachment onto their land. And when they don't have that formalized, secure land tenure to fall back on and to defend their land, they're left in a really difficult position. And so Landesa is working with a number of governments to get them to recognize collective land rights as legitimate land holdings. Often it's the laws are written only to view individual land holdings. So I think kind of through those two angles and making sure that both women and Indigenous peoples have access to these land titles that can be really powerful tools in defending their land and also giving them the power to manage it in a way that is meaningful both for them and their livelihoods, but also we can see positive environmental outcomes at the same time. To pose the question back to you, I think it would be really helpful to hear more about King Philanthropies broadly, how you're seeing climate action and climate change as part and parcel of the development work that you're doing, and then kind of adding that next layer on top. How are you addressing some of these social issues around gender and Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, no, great. Thanks, Rachel. And I will say that we are big fans of Landesa. Landesa is actually one of our grantees in our portfolio, and we've had a long relationship with Landesa. So everything that Rachel's saying, and I think we have Khalil here, who is our moderator. So I'll just pause for a moment. Khalil, maybe you want to introduce yourself. Rachel and I have been just asking questions to one another, but now that you're back, you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll go back into my answer.
Yes, good morning for those on the West Coast. Well, I guess it's still morning on this side too as well. I apologize for being late. I had an emergency that turned out to not to be an emergency at my son's school that did not involve my son. It was just really crazy morning. Good morning. My name is Khalil Shahid. I'm a managing director for equity and for environmental and equity strategies, with the Natural Resources Defense Council based here in the DC office. And I am your moderator. Again, apologize for being late, but let's just dive right back in to the session.
Okay, great. Thanks, Khalil. So, Rachel, to your question, a little bit about King Philanthropies first. King Philanthropies, we are, a Bay Area family office. Our principal, Bob King, and his wife, Dottie King, they have, have a deep commitment to issues around extreme poverty and mitigating extreme poverty. And when we say extreme poverty, we're looking at populations that are living on less than $1.90 a day. So King Philanthropies, we make grants, both from straight grants. We also do investments in social ventures and high-performing nonprofits operating in developing countries. Specifically, we've been focused on, over the last 2 years, in sectors such as agribusiness, agriculture generally, nutrition, education, women and girls education, as well as health. And we've been primarily focused in a couple of countries: Myanmar, India, Liberia, and Tanzania, although that has now changed and we're more broadly focused across. We look for where the opportunities are. Rachel, to your question, we, from an investor perspective, King Philanthropies is relatively new to the climate space. I have a background. I'm new to King Philanthropies. I spent over 10 years at the World Bank Group, first on the public sector side, and then lastly, before I left, at the International Finance Corporation on the private sector side, looking at private sector development issues. And I was always, very aware and worked very closely on climate change issues. But moving to King Philanthropies was always more focused on extreme poverty and mitigating extreme poverty. But we realized, look, the challenge is that climate change is a threat to global economic development everywhere. And the surest way out of poverty is through economic development. We've seen that. But as climate change makes weather events more frequent, more extreme, food and water security are at risk, and agricultural supply chains, coastal cities are threatened, we're seeing that low-income countries and low-income populations, they're suffering disproportionately from these climate effects, and they're bearing significant costs. We're seeing, numbers that it could push 100 million more people into poverty by 2030. And the poverty numbers have actually, pre-COVID, extreme poverty numbers had been declining. So these costs, they come as asset losses from a financial perspective, and they could exceed almost 300 billion annually. And then that's like lost consumption, which is another additional 250 billion annually. So for us, it just completely makes sense to be playing in this space and to say, how can our capital have that catalytic effect? How can we support organizations like Landesa, who are doing extremely important work around land rights and land tenure and providing low-income smallholder farmers the ability to use their land and their property as collateral to improve their livelihoods and to basically make themselves more resilient to the impacts that are already there and that are going to be coming in the future. But that, in a nutshell, is what we're doing. One of the things when you talk about the social element, I think that's something that we've seen very clearly. We focus very much on livelihoods and livelihood benefits and how to improve livelihoods. But at the same time, what we're finding with climate change, and it's part of our work with Landesa, is we're saying it's not just improving livelihoods, it's protecting existing gains that climate change threatens, right? So if you think of, gender, right? If you think of like agricultural benefits that populations have received over the last few years because of stronger crop programs, stronger fertilizer programs and such, we're saying, how can we protect these going forward and into the future? And that's where our funding comes in. And I'll give you, a perfect example, very concrete. And this is from my World Bank days. I used to work in Ukraine, and we would look at crop receipts. Basically, we would say, Ukrainian farmers are at the mercy, and Ukraine is like the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, and they're at the mercy of a lot of drought, flooding, extreme weather events. And what they couldn't do is they couldn't get financing for themselves to basically, they weren't able to attract financing to help, I apologize for a bit of the background noise, but they weren't able to attract financing that allowed them to plan out for the future. So what we did at the World Bank was we developed a crop receipt program that would allow them to bank on future harvests at a discounted rate, and that they were able to get finance, use those as assets in a way to get financing now. And these are some kind of innovative financial instruments that we've been using and that we're looking at using in the philanthropic space to address some of the social issues and social impact issues while addressing climate change. But I will pause there.
That's really amazing. Thanks, Kartik, and thanks for really taking the time. And now that I feel caught up, with your response there, I want to continue to move us forward. So this next question that we pulled together, I'm gonna adjust it a little bit because from what I heard from your conversation here, I think it's important to maybe draw out, some lessons, some best practices, for how we can continue to move things forward. And one of the key sticking points that continues to be a sticking point, and perhaps it shouldn't be, but I feel like the relationship between climate action and develop can really help resolve some of that conversation a lot more. Is the dichotomy, sometimes tension, we can say, between efforts to mitigate climate, which is seen as in the future tense, and those efforts to adapt and to build resilience to existing climate impacts. And so, you all, have experience, across, many local environments, with, developing local initiatives. Can you talk about, what are some of those key lessons that we can learn, and particularly thinking about, how efforts to mitigate climate action through development can also coincide and complement efforts to adapt to those changes that are already underway.
Kartik, I'm happy to take a stab at that.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Rachel, and then I'll come on top of you.
Sure. I think, I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but I think maybe a concrete example, Khalil, would be in our work with Inland S's work in Liberia and Tanzania. We're working with a lot of communities that are going through customary land formalization. So they've had land that they've managed for many, many years, but it's not legally recognized by the national governments, which really leaves them exposed to land grabs or other land conflicts. And in working with them through this process, it's a whole land use planning process and can be done in a variety of ways. And so historically and often it's done by this land use planning step is done by a government official or some sort of far removed individual who may or may not visit the land, writes up some sort of generic plan that doesn't consider the local context or the needs of the community, and submits that so that they can advance in this formalization process. And so we've been working directly with communities to make sure that the process is participatory and includes perspectives from particularly women, but a really variety of stakeholders within the communities. But on top of that, pushing the communities to have some sort of conversation around conservation opportunities or climate risks that they've been experiencing. And even if we aren't calling it climate change or climate risks, really getting them to reflect on the last couple decades and see how maybe their crop yields have changed, or growth patterns or seasons or precipitation patterns have changed, and kind of build that into their land use planning so that the goals that they have for very long-term livelihoods or productive lands can take into consideration climate risks. And from there, we can work with governments and their agriculture extension services, or different CSOs who are perhaps providing, as Kartik mentioned, maybe fertilizer inputs or climate smart agriculture trainings, or some of these capacity building opportunities and resources, so that in the development work, there's an acknowledgement of climate change happening, and engaging communities through that work to consider climate change and build resilience in that same step. I don't think it can be viewed as separate tracks. It sort of has to be this broader systems thinking that takes into account the reality of climate change.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Rachel says on that, and I agree with it. There's a systems approach, and it's look, at the end of the day, when you're you're a smallholder farmer in Tanzania and you're working a plot of land, you're not really thinking about climate change in this way we're thinking about it, sitting here in San Francisco or in DC or in Seattle. It's not. They're looking at it and they're saying, hold on a minute, weather patterns are changing. They bank on certain, right? Just certain, they look at it and they say, last year, this is how much rainfall, but this year I'm not getting as much rainfall. So it's a change. And I think what you have to do is there's an education element around it. So there's a government incentives element around it. There's an education element around it, in the work that like Landesa is doing and others are doing in this space. And then there is, very much from a funder's perspective and a financing perspective, there's a work that needs to be done that, funders will typically go and they'll look at, what's a newfangled kind of innovation or invention or something that we can finance. But really you have to finance and look at how can you get, herders and pastoralists talking to one another when you're looking at places in like the Sahel region where they're really getting hit so hard by desertification, drought, and such. How do you get them to talk to one another? Because the challenge are climate change is this kind of threat multiplier where it takes existing vulnerabilities and it just heightens them. So it's not going to be a technological solution. It's going to be getting Indigenous communities to talk to one another to understand how can we mitigate this through participatory methods. So when Rachel talks about kind of a systems change as well, it's at all levels, right? So there's a need for governments to reach net zero on carbon emissions. There's a need for the private sector to provide more financing, philanthropic sector and governments to do that for the energy transition. But there's a need for discussions to take place at a local level, and very, very much at that level that says, look, things are just going to get worse. So how can we adapt to that getting worse? And how can we do it by talking to one another?
That's right. Yeah. Thank you for that, Kartik, and as well, Rachel. Yeah, it seems too often, particularly in the U.S. and the way that we approach both climate policy, climate discussions domestically, and in the way that we present in the international level. I think that there's a influence, a relationship between our domestic conversations and the way that we present internationally, with the overemphasis on technology that seems to neglect a real appreciation of the way risk to climate change are really socially mediated. When we talk about climate risk and vulnerability, we're talking about those social factors that increase risk to certain populations, due to historical reasons, infrastructure, et cetera. And when we lead and really stop, the conversation at the point of technology, we really miss the full integration of those social risk factors, gender being one of the primary ones. So thank you for that. So continuing to move us forward, I wonder if you all can speak to, because we are still in this moment where we're dealing with the global pandemic that is COVID, with new variants, continuing to emerge and to stifle efforts to contain and to reach a state of normalcy. Can you talk about the impact and the influence of the COVID pandemic and what lessons that we can take, from the way governments locally, but also internationally have responded or even failed to respond to the COVID pandemic adequately, and what lessons can we take for the way that we approach climate change?
Yeah, Rachel, I'm happy to kick off. I think from a poverty perspective, we've been seeing, and I mentioned this before, but the pandemic really had a hit on many aspects of livelihoods of the extreme poor, right? From lack of access to education, specifically for women and girls, just because they can't pivot to virtual in the way we can where we're sitting. Lack and there were lack of income, lost income from many different aspects. But so we saw this decline, we saw this increase in poverty through the pandemic, right? COVID-19, and the World Bank has put out some studies that showcase that increase in poverty. I think what we're going to see is the same kind of increase in poverty levels with climate change. And what we're seeing with the pandemic is just in some ways like a foreshadow of what will come to pass if we don't do these things and we don't get the policies right. So at a global level, looking at, what would a price on carbon look like globally? So we're taking into account carbon emissions, and we're taking into account these externalities that we don't actually take into account now when we fill up our gas tank and others. I think when you're looking at the pandemic, you're definitely seeing a window into what can happen in the future. And what we're seeing now is we saw the unequalness in vaccine distribution, and it's the same thing in terms of the unequalness of climate financing. There's a tremendous amount of capital that goes into climate mitigation. So bringing down emissions and reducing emissions, there's less capital, significantly less capital that goes into climate adaptation work. So helping low-income communities adapt to climate change, to rising sea levels, to increased drought, and such. And I think the role Landesa is playing in that has been extremely important. Landesa and other organizations in looking at how do we allow people to have that, enable them to have that land tenure, those land rights. How do we protect community land rights across the board, so the communities who are best placed to adapt to climate change, they know best how to do so, have the ability to do that. And then what I would also say is, the third thing what the pandemic has showed is that there is this sense that there's this unequalness in response on how countries should respond to the pandemic. I think, we have the different vaccines available to us in Western Europe and Canada and the United States in more of the industrialized world. And what we're finding too is, in the climate side, when you make investments in nuclear fission technology or wind and solar technology, you're doing that, there's an affordability gap. You need Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia, East Asia Pacific to move from the energy transition. They need to move from coal to cleaner energy, but that comes at a massive cost. And to tell these countries and these low income populations, you have to bear that cost without providing the financing to do so. Whereas we have the financing to be able to move to wind, move to solar, move to develop battery storage technology. There's a fundamental inequity in that approach, and I think the pandemic has shown that from a vaccine perspective, and I think it foreshadows what may come from a climate perspective.
Great, thank you.
To build on that, Kartik, because you raised some excellent points, I think another layer is this foreshadowing of migration and the movement of people, where I think when we're often talking about development efforts, it's in this imagined world where things are very stationary and very stagnant in the human movement sense. And particularly our team in India was, seeing these really interesting migration patterns where historically it's been rural communities who need to seek out alternative livelihoods in more urban areas. So it's a lot of men leaving more rural villages to urban centers, perhaps seasonally, to make some extra income and return to their village. And with COVID, there was this huge push to leave these highly dense population centers. And so a lot of people who were living in cities were seeking more space and trying to return to perhaps their family's historical rural village. And, kind of these conflicting migration trends of rural to urban and urban to rural does bring up questions around migration, particularly in the context of, we have COVID pushing migration. We also have climate induced migration, where people are moving permanently due to livelihoods loss, or perhaps temporarily in a crisis setting with a natural disaster hitting, and them needing to find safe ground elsewhere. And I think land rights comes up then as well of creating really difficult incentive structures of people asking questions of, a cyclone is expected to hit. If they leave their land and return in a few weeks, will their land still legally be theirs? Or do they need to stay and defend this land from others who may encroach upon it in the meantime? And so I think the pandemic has presented new complications and new layers of how this movement of human populations could really play out as climate change becomes more complex in the future. When I was listening to Kartik's answer, it does feel like a lot of the themes that are coming up are around climate justice and environmental justice. And in this conversation of climate finance, I think there is a ton of questions around how money will be reaching, who will be benefiting, and how funding will actually reach the Indigenous peoples and local communities that these pledges and commitments have called out as key stakeholders. I think the carbon market and payments for ecosystem services are real steps in the right direction of investing in these communities for doing this sustainable land management. There's been a lot of expectations from the global community that smallholders show up in this way without compensation or recognition of how the entire globe benefits from their sustainable land management. So when they're mitigating climate change and mitigating these emissions, the benefits are global, even though the action is very local. And so figuring out ways to make that finance more accessible and more easily available to these rural smallholders, I think is a really critical step in making sure that there's this global buy-in that we talk about in some of these global commitments that have come out. We're often seeing, even when a market does exist, the accessibility is really limited due to the size of individuals' land plots and the cost that it takes to participate in these markets. So it's a really strong start, but I think that there are still a few walls to break down in actually getting that finance into the hands of the people doing the work.
Yeah, Rachel, it sounds like, with especially that last piece there, that there's still some degree to which climate action is disjointed from the development priority and what the actual needs are, say, for smallholder farmers, and how they participate, in this transition into this, post-carbon economy. That there's still a bit of disjointedness. And I wonder if, we've noticed it here, or at least I have, that, climate has really come to eclipse, particularly within the environmental community, that I exist in. Climate has come to eclipse everything. And so, we used to speak about climate change as a symptom, or global warming, as a symptom or an outcome of unsustainable development. And so the relationship between climate and development was that it was unsustainable development that causes climate change. And so to address climate change, we needed to shift to a much more sustainable development pathway, right? But today, you are more likely to see that relationship articulated as sustainable development being a co-benefit or an outcome of successful climate action. And so we are running around trying to solve the emissions puzzle in a way that's disjointed from the development imperative and the development question. And I think, we need to figure out how to rebalance those scales to a degree, to reprioritize the development question in the context of climate action, particularly if we are, have any hopes of making an equitable transition into climate change. And so I wonder if you all, again, and so, we, over the past few weeks, and I think, we're still trying to understand the implications of the most recent Conference of Parties, the COP26 conference in Glasgow last month. So can you all talk a little bit about, how we might leverage those discussions, the current framework, the new pledges that were made, and particularly, what role does land and natural resources, do you see that having an elevated priority going forward, where it was, perhaps maybe undervalued or underappreciated in what role it could play?
Yeah, it's Khalil, it's a great question. I think, look, I think the globe coming together, at COP in Glasgow, and I'm speaking for Rachel, but I think Rachel and I, because we're looking at land rights and we're looking at the space very closely, we both followed COP very closely. I think I want to take a little bit of bigger picture on COP. One of the things with COP and what happened at the G7 meeting prior to that, and it relates to the question we just talked about around COVID-19, and I think it highlighted this. Look, if sustainable recovery solutions are not prioritized writ large, right? Things like COVID-19 that keep coming up, and with new variants and others, they're going to delay global climate commitments, and these are going to exacerbate the disparities. And we've seen the pandemic; it's highlighted its disparities in coping with shocks from both developed and developing countries, between rich and poor, within all countries, right? So I think what I looked at with COP was COP could have been this retreat from global climate commitments, but it wasn't, right? Now, was it the kind of silver bullet? Definitely not. Was it an incremental improvement? Yes, I think it was an incremental improvement. I think that we've seen some of these commitments before around stopping deforestation. We've seen some of these commitments before around providing Indigenous communities with more financial capital, all right, to be able to have a swifter energy transition or a more equitable energy transition. The question really, I think what was more optimistic for me from COP was, it was the first time I really saw the private sector come to the table. And I say that, in this interesting role in philanthropy, where it's between public and private sector, and you're providing kind of catalytic financing. But the commitments that were made by Mark Carney and others, while not perfect, and they're huge sums, I mean, you're talking hundreds of trillions of dollars, people can't even wrap their mind around that. But the fact that private sector is now committed fully to this net zero, and many private sectors, to be fair, private sector actors, to be fair, are doing that from a marketing perspective. There are others that are looking at that, doing that from a much more substantive perspective. But I looked at that as optimistic, especially for issues around looking at how do you protect or protect certain community kind of forests, how do you protect community land, how do you bolster protection for aquatic ecosystems, mangroves, carbon sequestration, generally agroforestry, issues like that. I think that's incredibly important. It's a step in the right direction. What I would say is that we now need to have government catch up and provide the incentives so that the private sector is able to take some of that financing and find bankable projects. And that is the biggest issue, right? That's the biggest issue that COP wasn't able to address, is where are the actual, you'll have the money, but how do you actually develop from the ground up bankable opportunities and projects for financiers to come in, for philanthropic organizations to come in and invest over there. So that in a nutshell is kind of my takeaway from COP.
To add to that, I think it goes back to kind of your intro to the question, Khalil, of talking about the development sector and climate action and kind of maybe how that relationship has evolved over time. And I feel like in the past, climate change has been viewed as an explicitly environmental issue. And I think in the past 10 or 15 years, we've been framing it a lot more as a human-centered issue. And it's not human in the sense that, you know, we're causing the emissions that are affecting nature. It's really looking at these closer interactions between people and the environment and elevating the land use sector as a key player in this whole field. I think previously it had been seen as kind of industry and energy, and then on the other hand, more of this like pristine nature conservation element. And I think what we see a lot of in this past COP especially was a focus on livelihoods and looking at sustainable agriculture and looking at communities that are forest users as part of the climate solution. And so if you look at the deforestation pledge that came out at the beginning of COP, in addition to all the finance that was committed, it explicitly pulled out sustainable agriculture and forest livelihoods as a necessary part of this commitment and this path forward, so that deforestation is not viewed in the pure conservation sense, but it includes human engagement and human livelihoods and communities as well. And so I thought that was really exciting to see Indigenous peoples included more explicitly throughout solutions and pledges, and just a broader recognition of smallholders as necessary stakeholders in this broader climate change effort. I think in addition to COP, there's so much focus put on the UNFCCC, which is really important, but recognizing that it is one of 3 Rio conventions and seeing the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention to Combat Desertification as almost equal components of these 3 conventions, and seeing really, although they're approaching environmental issues from different angles, you have climate change, desertification, and biodiversity. The core of all those is focused on land management. And how are we using the land? Is it sustainable? Are there solutions that we could find at that juncture around land governance and management that could achieve positive outcomes across all 3 Rio conventions? This panel is focused on the SDGs, and we have SDG 13 on climate action that does not include land as it within the conversation around climate action. And it's, I think, a real loss there. And of course, land is included in so many other SDGs, and a lot of those also include climate elements, even though they aren't explicitly in the climate action stream. There's so much overlap between all of them. And so I think just in working with governments with limited capacity, there needs to be more of an effort to find overlap between these global conventions and these competing priorities, and really working with governments to support them in their limited capacity to select interventions that can advance the SDGs and the Rio conventions and human rights frameworks across the board. We can't be presenting them as these separate channels that need individual attention. It needs to be a broader, comprehensive look at how, I guess, the development sector is functioning and how that can overlay with other priorities that are equally as important.
Yeah, thank you. Really quick, Rachel, to follow up. And so my understanding was that, and you're absolutely right about land not being explicitly mentioned amongst the SDG targets, but aren't the climate goal under the SDGs is really meant to refer back to that UNFCCC process, and because they didn't want to, create something that would, perhaps appear to be conflictual with that process, and so that they were kind of deferential to it. And so, are there is there language within the UNFCCC process and those agreements that more explicitly tie back to land that can be leveraged in the SDGs?
Absolutely. And I didn't mean to say that it's not included in the SDGs broadly. It's more that climate action SDG.
Yes.
And there is a lot of communication across the Rio conventions and between the SDGs and climate efforts. I think there could just be one step further to align metrics or align reporting mechanisms or finance streams to more make it a more collaborative and cooperative process, rather than trying to compete for the attention of these limited governments.
That makes sense. This is great, and I feel like if we had a better way of articulating this conversation, I feel like much of the discussion, particularly at the international level, around equity in climate policy, deals with debates over historical emissions versus present day emissions, per capita emissions versus aggregate emissions, but I feel like what a lot of that really boils down to, and what isn't being said, is it's guaranteeing or supporting the right to development, for people and nations, which seems to be really critical. And again, and once you frame it from that, then the question around access to land and land rights becomes really prominent for that discussion when you frame it in that way. And so I think we're still missing that conversation. And so we have about 15-20 minutes left. So I want to shift over now, if it's okay with you all, to audience questions. And we have one coming from James Daly, where he says, land tenure rights should be granted for sure, but what happens when the land itself is failing due to drought? Climate resilience in a world where the land itself is failing in market value must mean something different, right? And so I think what he's asking is, if we are creating market-based strategies for climate resilience, what happens for those communities where the land no longer has any market value? And I think this is something that we will deal with both in rural communities, land-based communities, but also we're also going to deal with this in a lot of urban communities where we see a lot of disinvestment, marginalized communities, impoverished communities in cities where real estate just doesn't have any value. And so I think this is going to be a common thread across rural and urban divides. But can you get to that question?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and it's a good question. So James, thanks for posing it. I think the way I would look at this, from a philanthropic perspective or a funder's perspective, is that, and you're right, land matters to climate. I think it's the issue. So when I think of land, I'm thinking of like sub-Saharan Africa, and I think of like what has been happening in terms of kind of clear cutting and plantation style development that has really left land on where you have basically kind of soil have been eroded, and you don't have its increased vulnerability for populations living around or on that land. So when I look at it and I say, hey, there's a structure and a functioning of these kind of managed and unmanaged ecosystems, and land is a very managed ecosystem, right? And it affects both, local, regional, global climate issues. So I think that there is, and I'm seeing it from my fellow funders, there is this focus on how do you look at restoring soils of degraded ecosystems? How do you look at that from a carbon perspective, right? I think that some of the numbers being thrown out is it's like 3 billion tons of carbon annually can be stored by restoring soils of degraded ecosystems. And I think there's this movement, and Rachel spoke about it, to the COP question. There's this movement saying we're not just looking at it as climate mitigation anymore, and we're looking at climate adaptation, but we're also looking at ecosystem loss. And I've seen that in the literature. I've seen that in terms of how finance is moving in that direction as well. So I think that there's an opportunity. I understand this issue around when market values for land, when they fall, but there is this issue of how do we get more to the circular economy? How do we start focusing on restoring soils for degraded ecosystems? How do we focus on restoring coastal ecosystems as well? And, I would point to some of the work that Landesa is doing, especially kind of in the mangrove space, in the forest space, in Myanmar, in areas in Liberia, in Tanzania as well, as a way of saying land tenure is incredibly important, because just having those rights and having that ability to have an asset, no matter what the quality of that asset is, Indigenous populations know best how to treat their land. At a local level, they know best how to rehabilitate that land, how to use that land appropriately for their own development perspectives and for their own livelihood increases. So what I would say is I don't look at land as once it's kind of gone, it's gone. I think there is this movement towards the restoration of those degraded lands.
To build on that, I think it's a great question, and it is a really tough question. I know the lead scientist for the UN Convention to Combat Desertification estimated that if we invested what is spent on the military in 60 days, if we were to invest that in soil restoration, we would buy ourselves the time necessary to develop the technologies and restructure our economies to be able to really make a dent in climate change and meet these 1.5 degree commitments that we've made. And so I think, as Kartik has said, I think land has been not appreciated to its fullest extent as a carbon sink and a climate mitigation tool. I think on the flip side of this desertification issue, we also have sea level rise and we have flooding issues. And so Kartik mentioned our work in the mangroves, but these investments in coastal forests, they're incredible carbon sinks, so there's climate mitigation there, but there's also huge adaptation benefits for the communities and farmlands more inland, where you're having sort of these storm breaks that slow down the storm surge and reduce the impact of these increasing natural disasters and intensified storms and precipitation. So it's, there are situations where the land is being degraded, and then there's others where the land is literally disappearing. And so to equip communities with the incentives to invest in that forest restoration and preservation and tie that environmental work to economic impacts for them of protecting their food security and their livelihoods through these inland farmlands, creating fish habitat within the mangroves and having another nutrition source, as well as income opportunity with fishing there. I think there's it's a very important question around the value of land, but I think if there is more of that long-term vision, there can be investments now that will help to restore that land and make it more valuable moving forward.
Thank you both. I just want to remind our audience to, if you have any questions, just please submit them into the chat link, and we'll try to get to them promptly. I wanted to maybe follow up this discussion and this question with maybe looking at it the flip side. And so, those areas that have been economically marginalized have seen their value depressed, through, environmental causes such as desertification or through other means. may be at a competitive disadvantage, in a market-based, response to climate change. But then looking at it in the other direction, the present day value of land, isn't the only incentive to want to invest in that space. And so there could be speculative value, that could be a way to approach that investment. And so, what risk then do those same communities have when an area that has been economically marginalized, by markets suddenly see an influx of new types of investment into those areas? And again, we see this a lot, particularly in urban communities. We talk about gentrification, but I think that there's also a potential corollary in many rural communities as well, when we see the influx of these new dollars into these spaces. And how can we protect communities from that kind of speculative investment?
It's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that one. I mean, but it's, what I'd say is, I think it comes back down to, I like what Rachel said around systems. I mean, and the thing is, systems, that use of systems, or that systems word is always a tricky word, right? I mean, because it's used across the board, but it represents so much. I think, there are, so I'll take a stab at this and say there's a broad approach that we need to take to climate finance and just generally climate change. It has to come at all levels, right? So, there's an educational level, and there is, like, really at the rural, at the Indigenous level, like, understanding what climate change looks like, but you have to focus it on solutions. So for smallholder farmers, like, what does that mean? Like, can they get access to drought resistant seeds, right? Can they get access to small pots of financing that will allow them to plant crops, and they don't have to worry that, are there financial instruments available, that they don't have to worry that if the crop fails this year, they're out then for this year. They don't have any income left to support their families. So what, can governments provide the incentives? How can the private sector play a role? And I think all of these different actors coming together, and I think this is where, COP would set the framework at a larger level, but then you have to have these discussions just like we're having now, right? And the SDGs provides a really nice framework for that. But can we have these discussions between funders and implementers and civil society, and then the local beneficiaries as well, and governments, where we talk about what are all the different mechanisms that need to be put in place: incentives, investment, participatory dialogue, where we can then have an equitable approach. I think, that's, so it doesn't address your question around speculative investing, but it's saying is you can maybe mitigate some of that. Look, you're going to have that wherever you go, right? But you can maybe mitigate some of that by coming together and saying, okay, here's the problem, here's certain solutions, and we have, a number of these solutions out there. This is how we can implement them. So a broad answer to your question.
That's a good answer.
An equally broad answer. Your question reminded me of our Landessa's work with women potato farmers in India. And they were working on, there was not a situation where we could secure tenure for them due to, in part, national laws, but also social norms of women were not comfortable owning land in that context. But we were able to set up these long-term leasing commitments. And it's, again, one of those development solutions that sounded good on paper, and then once you actually implement it. And so it was this situation where women were working with PepsiCo to produce potatoes, but that was only for one season of that land. And so they were repeatedly leasing the land for that season to grow potatoes, and they were practicing sustainable land management, and they had, really intentional, smart choices around fertilizers and till practices and harvesting. And that was starting to restore the soil, and then their other counterparts who were not working directly with would come in for the other non-potato seasons and really degrade some of these benefits. And there was an understanding that these women were having climate smart practices, and so that was benefiting these other land users. And so I think it's not directly answering your question, but I think it's kind of bringing up sort of these short-term solutions, if they don't have that long vision, can be taken advantage of, I think, in the short term by other actors. I think the other point that I want to highlight that Kartik brought up that I really liked was around diversification of the interventions and solutions. And I think that's one thing that both COVID and climate change has really highlighted, of the vulnerabilities in putting all your eggs in one basket. I think a lot of times with different development interventions, it's sort of presented as the silver bullet, and we're all going to go with that solution now. And so I think it's an obvious answer, but I think the strongest ones are the ones that kind of overlay multiple solutions and offer a variety of options for these communities. And I think, to return to our work in Myanmar, the work looking at, restoring mangroves can protect inland farmlands. It can create fish habitat, which are 2 income sources. They also can start beekeeping more intentionally, and mangrove honey is a really lucrative product. And so each of these things that would not be enough on their own to sustain these communities from a food security perspective or an income perspective, but combined, they're a lot stronger. And also then if the croplands fail, or if they're flooded, they have alternatives to fall back on. And so I think the risks that you refer to is perhaps in just committing too fully to solely one solution, rather than kind of diversifying our approach.
Yeah, thank you. I really like that. I think, the first point you made, and paraphrasing, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting it, but I think in part it's about making sure that local communities are able to capture the value of those investments. Like in the case of those women who were making positive contributions to the health of the soil, but weren't actually getting the long-term benefits of their work to actually improve the soil. And I think, and absolutely going back to Kartik's point about, multi-factor inputs, but also I think which again brings back to the SDGs, having the 17 goals and really not looking at any individual goal in isolation, but seeing how they work cross tandem with others, and then also bringing it back to that local factor and allowing that local communities to really determine that path. And I think we often think of the SDGs as this global framework. We look at the 17 goals, the different tiles, the colors, it looks beautiful, and we don't necessarily maybe talk enough about the localization and the way, either at the country level or even at the at the district or community level, can really take that broad SDG framework and really drill it down to create local targets and goals that really are much more specific to local context. Like again, with the women potato farmers in India, but then also again thinking of what are those necessary linkages between, say, land rights and the governance and inclusion goals, and how those two really complement each other and are necessary to kind of come together. That's a really important conversation. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. I haven't seen any other questions yet from our audience, so I'm going to issue one more call. Again from the audience for any questions. But in the meantime, we can begin to move into wrapping up. But any final comments, thoughts, or just sort of self summary that you all want to give.
Khalil, I think there is one more question
Oh, we do.
in the chat there. I was trying to pull it up.
I did not get it.
It is coming your way.
Do, 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 do. I do not have it.
I'm happy to read it. if
Yeah,
that
you
would
can
be
go
helpful.
ahead, Rachel. Take over.
So it's
Oh, here it
another
is.
question. Oh, you got it? Okay.
Yeah, it came very slowly. Yeah, apologies, everyone. Yeah, so this question begins about metrics and mechanisms. So, what metrics and mechanisms are missing? Is land ownership concentration, ag industrialization, fisheries domination by large processors, the anti-patterns, or are those the issues that we're trying to solve against here? Are there, or is there a Goldilocks approach that you think is the right way to do development? And how does that run counter to geopolitical trends? And so how does the imperative towards equitable development run contrary to economic growth, for example? And therefore, what mechanisms are needed in policy, law, and international treaties are necessary? And I'm sorry, whoever submitted that question, if I butchered it with my own commentary.
Yeah, it's a tough question. So James, I think you submitted the question. Yeah, tough questions, big question. Let me say, I don't think there's a Goldilocks approach to or a right way to do development. I think, when you're saying, so I'm taking the second part of your question first, but, is there a right way to do development that does, and how does that run counter to geopolitical trends? I think we've talked about this before. I think there has to be interventions at all levels, right? I think that when you're looking at international development, it is not, there are so many different actors that play in the poverty alleviation space, from, the World Bank Group to regional development banks to bilateral donors, thinking of countries and United States, Canada, the UK. I think what you need to look at is saying, how do you actually make development more broadly, more sustainable and more inclusive? And I say that is, and I'm going to put a point, and Rachel and Khalil and I had discussed this, previously, and Rachel raised the issue of migration. Take migration. A lot of people think climate change, and they say climate change is really going to be extreme weather events. It's going to be, wildfires, drought, rising sea levels. Yes, that's all that's true, and we're seeing those extreme weather events, daily. Every year they get worse, and we'll continue to see those, so long as we don't mitigate the carbon emissions. But I think where we're seeing climate change even much more pointedly, and this is what I say, as I say, the rubber hits the road, is look at issues around migration, right? Climate change is going to result in just much more kind of destabilized politics and more populism. And you're seeing that globally everywhere. You had 1 million refugees in 2016, 2017 come into Western Europe and into Germany from the Syrian war, which in a lot of ways, there was many different dimensions to that war. One of the challenges is, the extreme drought that is occurring throughout that region in the Middle East, right? If you look at the Tigris River right now, you're going to see even more of that as that dries up, and it's the lifeblood for Iraq, Syria, in the Anatolia region in Turkey as it flows down. Think of the Indian subcontinent, think of Afghanistan, think of what's happening over there in a lot of ways. We're going to see that million 7-fold, 8-fold, 10-fold. And those are just the estimates that we're going to see over the next few years, let alone internal migration from rural to urban. that is going to, and that kind of migration destabilizes global politics and it destabilizes national politics. So when you ask about how does it run counter to geopolitical trends and what approach is needed, I think that there needs to be this approach where you've seen what's happened in Belarus recently, right? Many of those migrants are coming from Afghanistan. Many of them are coming from Iraq. They're coming from places where they just don't have access to water, crops are failing, and all of that. But we saw the approach that was taken by the European Union and the Belarusians in dealing with this. We've seen what's been happening in Hungary. We've seen what's been happening in other places. We've seen the destabilization of national politics. I think this is where you need to spend more time making government policies more inclusive and having, a bit more of building resilience among migrant populations for how to deal with climate change, and then focusing investments in adaptation so that they don't have to leave their countries. Nobody wants to leave and be a climate refugee, right? It's tough to do that. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
Thanks, Kartik. Rachel?
I know we're short on time, so I can make my answer short. Yeah. I think this question made me think of our scalability approach at Landesa, that when we're talking about development work, Landesa is relatively very small. And so we work directly with governments and work with them at the local levels to build incentives for scaling that work through policy reform. And so really creating a proof of concept and illustrating the value in land tenure, in this climate action, in whatever intervention you're pushing forward, to make sure that government actors are still in the driver's seat and managing, their own countries in the way that they see best. I think we often play more of a supporting role in that context. When we're looking at this local to national work, I think it's I don't know if it's necessarily that investments need to shift from the global to national to local level. I think it's more that there needs to be increased communication between those different levels and make sure that the people at COP making these decisions are aware of what's happening on the ground and the efficacy of these local interventions and the experiences of Indigenous peoples and local communities, to make sure that those experiences are being reflected in national policies and then back up to these global commitments, and the reverse as well. Make sure that these global pledges are being reflected in national policy and then effectively implemented down to the local level. So in looking at development work more broadly, I think it needs to engage all those levels of governance and the private sector as a key actor as well.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I would add, I wonder if there's also, and this is again to go back to the COP26, if there's also a lesson here for the role of civil society really cross-nationally in building a common conversation, similar to what has happened around climate change, right? Although, there are still, particularly, in domestic politics, many laggards who are still, slow dragging or in denial about both, the reality and the potential, impact and damage that climate change can cause. By and large, the COP process has been able to bring, nations across the globe together to work on a common goal, a common framework, and it's kind of to some degree disciplined them to say, you have to do this. This is a global standard that we are setting, and I wonder how we can also do that, around, frameworks such as the SDGs, but really, around, these social outcomes, for rights, for inclusion, and the role that civil society can play in really continuing, to push that and to make sure that, and it doesn't mean that we're all the same, but there is sort of a common expectation and standards amongst nations. Okay. We are at approaching time, but I wanted to just give you all, brief, 30 seconds, 1 minute, just any, last thoughts if you have it, no pressure if you don't. I just wanted to give you Kartik and Rachel just one more time, and thank you so much, for the time that you've already spent, and for the wisdom that you've already shared. I just want to give you just another moment.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, Khalil, first, thank you. Thanks for moderating the session. I'm glad there was no emergency, and it's that's always great. And I know those, you always dread those calls from the kids' schools, right? So but thanks for corralling us together and for the great questions. And then just to Rachel, it's always great, spending some time with you. So I really appreciate your perspective. And to everybody out there, we can't see you, but we know you're out there. So thanks so much for your questions and for joining the session. We're looking forward to collaborating and discussing more.
I couldn't say it better. I just echo what Kartik said. Thank you for moderating, Khalil, and always great to chat with you, Kartik.
Thank you, everyone. I'll turn it back over to Anthony, and you can close this out from here.